From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
So we must be able to act more swiftly. In 2002, NATO stood down its high readiness force. I hope that today we can agree a multinational spearhead force deployable anywhere in the world in just 2 to 5 days.
As Ukraine and pro-Russian rebels hold talks on a ceasefire, NATO announces the creation of a new force during a major summit in Wales. We'll speak to Professor Stephen Cohen. Then grossly negligent and reckless. That's how a federal judge described BP's conduct in the Gulf of Mexico oil spill 4 years ago. The ruling could force BP to pay nearly $18 billion in additional fines. We'll speak with Antonia Yuhas. Then 400 people are arrested as fast food workers go on strike across the country.
My CEO makes $6,000 an hour, and I only get $7 an hour. Dude, you're buying jets and going to the golf course and everything whenever I gotta struggle to get a bus pass to go to work for the next week.
That's not right.
We need more money and we need it now. So I'm gonna ask y'all this. What do we want? Do we want it?
No!
If we don't get it,
shut it down!
We don't get it,
shut it down!
We'll speak with Ashona Osborne, who works for Wendy's in Pittsburgh, and labor leader Mary Kay Henry, president of the SEIU, Service Employees International Union. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. More than 400 fast food workers and their supporters have been arrested in a national day of action for a $15 an hour minimum wage. Workers staged a one-day strike in 150 cities across the United States Thursday, from Las Vegas to Chicago and Detroit to Little Rock, Arkansas, and here in New York City.
We're gaining awareness and showing people in Albany that we deserve 15 in the union and that we're angry about the minimum wage. We don't believe in the minimum wage. We believe in a living wage.
We're asking and we're demanding for 15. We're not asking for so much. We're just asking for about so much so we could be able to live and survive in New York.
Those arrested engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience by blocking streets during rush hour. In addition to a living wage, workers are also seeking the right to unionize and improve workplace conditions, including consistent working hours. We'll have more on the fast food workers' strike later in the broadcast. A federal judge has ruled the oil giant BP was grossly negligent in the lead-up to the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the worst in U.S. history. The ruling could force BP to pay up to $18 billion in extra additional fines. Attorney General Eric Holder praised the ruling in Washington.
We are pleased that the district court in New Orleans has found that the largest oil spill in United States history was caused by BP's gross negligence and willful misconduct. The court's findings will ensure that the company is held fully accountable for its recklessness.
The ruling also found BP subcontractors Transocean and Halliburton negligent in the accident. BP says it'll immediately appeal. We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. The Justice Department has formally announced a civil rights probe of the police department in Ferguson, Missouri, where the unarmed African-American teenager Michael Brown was killed last month. The announcement follows weeks of protests sparked by Brown's death that brought to light allegations of racial profiling and other police abuses against African-American residents. On Thursday, Attorney General Eric Holder said his recent visit to Ferguson helped inform the investigation's scope.
I heard from them directly about the deep mistrust that has taken hold between law enforcement officials and members of that community. In meetings, as well as in listening sessions, as well as informal conversations, people consistently express concerns stemming from specific alleged incidents, from general policing practices, and from the lack of diversity on the Ferguson police force. In Ferguson, our investigation will assess the police department's use of force, including deadly force. It will analyze stops, searches, and arrests, and it will examine the treatment of individuals detained at Ferguson's city jail. in addition to other potentially discriminatory policing techniques and tactics that have been brought to light.
The investigation, separate from another civil rights investigation specifically into Brown's killing at the hands of Ferguson officer Darren Wilson. The probe could expand to other areas surrounding Ferguson and Missouri. A federal appeals court has overturned marriage equality bans in Wisconsin and Indiana, the latest in a series of rulings since the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act last year. One judge on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals said marriage equality bans are based on, quote, hate and savage discrimination against LGBT people. The rulings bring the number of states upholding marriage equality to 21. In a rare victory for opponents of marriage equality, a separate court upheld Louisiana's LGBT marriage ban earlier this week. The Ukrainian government and pro-Russian rebels are reportedly set to sign a ceasefire today aimed at ending over 6 months of fighting that's killed at least 2,600 people and displaced over 1 million. The deal is expected this morning in the Belarusian capital of Minsk as President Obama and European leaders meet in Wales for a major NATO summit. We'll have more on Ukraine after headlines with Professor Stephen Cohen. In Virginia, former Republican Governor Bob McDonnell and his wife have been found guilty of multiple corruption charges for accepting gifts from a prominent donor. The McDonnells received more than $140,000 from Star Scientific CEO Johnny Williams. Federal prosecutors contend McDonnell accepted the money in exchange for promoting Star Scientific's products and providing other favors. McDonnell was offered a plea bargain earlier this year, but opted instead to go to trial. His defense strategy largely entailed placing the blame on his wife, Maureen, who, as a non-public official, could not have been convicted of corruption charges on her own. McDonnell's attorneys argued the couple were too estranged to have conspired in a criminal manner. But jurors found McDonnell guilty of all the corruption charges against him. After the verdict was announced, Virginia District Attorney Dana Boente said McDonnell had violated the public trust.
This is a difficult and disappointing day for the Commonwealth and its citizens. Public service frequently requires sacrifice and almost always requires financial sacrifice. When public officials turn to financial gain in exchange for official acts, we have little choice but to prosecute the case.
Former Governor McDonnell is the first Virginia governor in history to be charged with a crime. His attorneys have vowed an appeal. Sentencing is scheduled for January 6th. Bob McDonnell's conviction comes days after another Republican-linked corruption case came to a close. Former Iowa State Senator Kent Sorensen has pleaded guilty to accepting a bribe for defecting from one presidential campaign to another right before Iowa's 2012 Republican caucuses. Sorensen accepted $73,000 to jump from Michelle Bachmann's team over to rival candidate Ron Paul's. Sorensen now faces up to 25 years behind bars. His guilty plea has had a domino effect in Kentucky, where Senator Mitch McConnell's campaign manager, Jesse Benton, has resigned. Benton ran Paul's campaign at the time of Sorensen's bribe. Former House Majority Leader Eric Cantor has landed a new job on Wall Street just months after a stunning primary loss. Cantor became the first House Majority Leader to ever lose a primary when he fell to Tea Party challenger David Brat. Brat ran on a staunch anti-immigrant platform, but some analysts say Cantor was done in by a voter backlash against his insider politics and close Wall Street ties. This week, the Wall Street investment bank Moelis & Company announced Cantor will serve as the company's vice chair and managing director for a base pay of $400,000 a year and a bonus of over $1 million in stock and cash. Newly disclosed emails show a national security reporter with the Los Angeles Times pre-cleared his stories with the CIA and promised the agency positive coverage. According to The Intercept, Ken Delanian had a closely collaborative relationship with the CIA that saw him send drafts of entire news stories prior to publication. In one case, he told a CIA press officer a story he was working on about congressional oversight of drone strikes, quote, can present a good opportunity for you guys in reassuring to the public. In another exchange, Delanian sent over an unpublished story in full with the subject header, "Does this look better?" The CIA's response appears to have led to major changes in at least one case. A spokesperson for Tribune newspapers says he appears to have violated company rules barring sharing of stories prior to publication. Now a reporter for the Associated Press, Delanian declined comment for The Intercept's story. And also in headlines today, Bahrain has detained the leading human rights activist, Mariam Akhawaja, after she tried to enter the country. Akhawaja says customs officials told her she no longer holds citizenship. She was trying to visit her ailing father, Abdul Hadi, who remains on a hunger strike in prison. Bahrain is a key U.S. government ally hosting the Navy's Fifth Fleet. And the comedian Joan Rivers has died at the age of 81. Rivers passed away Thursday, days after going into cardiac arrest during an outpatient procedure. New York authorities are now investigating the clinic, Yorkville Endoscopy, where she was undergoing the operation, but no wrongdoing is suspected. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Juan, before we go on to our first story, pre-K started yesterday. 51,000 students in New York City.
Yes, a big day in the New York City public schools system, the largest expansion, really, of public education in memory anywhere in the country, as 51,000 children under Bill de Blasio, Mayor Bill de Blasio's new plan to produce universal pre-K instruction by next year. That's 30,000 more children than were attending pre-K last year, full-day pre-K. In effect, adding an entire year to the school year for the children of New York City. As Mayor de Blasio said, he's hoping to lift all boats with this enormous reform in public education. And all around the country, educators are watching it, and who knows how many more cities may adopt it. It went off pretty much without a hitch. There were maybe a dozen or so programs that didn't meet the deadline, the goals of the city to have everything ready. But for the most part, many people were saying it couldn't be done because the legislature only approved the funding for it in March. But the city was able, working around the clock over the last few months, to recruit thousands of children, hire new teachers, train them, and also have about 1,100 community agencies that are participating with the school system in the program.
And as you've pointed out, the significance of the size, that this 51,000 students.
Oh, yes. Well, that's larger than the entire public school system of Seattle. So you see that this is a huge endeavor, and we'll see what happens in the future.
Well, now to international news.
Well, the Ukrainian government and pro-Russian rebels are reportedly set to sign a ceasefire today aimed at ending over 6 months of fighting in eastern Ukraine that has killed at least 2,600 people and displaced over 1 million. The deal is expected to be signed in the Belarusian capital, Minsk, as President Obama and European leaders meet in Wales for a major NATO summit. The ceasefire comes at a time when the Ukrainian military has suffered a number of defeats at the hands of the Russian-backed rebels. A new dispatch from the New York Review of Books reveals the remnants of at least 68 Ukrainian military vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, pickups, buses, and trucks are littered along one 16-mile stretch in eastern Ukraine, where the rebels launched an offensive last week. The reporter Tim Judah writes, quote, "The scale of the devastation suffered by Ukrainian forces in southeastern Ukraine over the last week has to be seen to be believed. It amounts to a catastrophic defeat and will long be remembered by embittered Ukrainians as among the darkest days of their history." In the hours leading up to the ceasefire, pro-Russian rebels launched another offensive to take the port city of Mariupol, which stands about halfway between Russia and the Crimea region. The Ukrainian government and NATO have accused Russia of sending forces into Ukraine, a claim that Moscow continues to deny.
Meanwhile, in Wales, NATO has announced plans to create a new rapid reaction force in response to the Ukraine crisis. British Prime Minister David Cameron said the new force could be deployed anywhere in the world in 2 to 5 days.
So we must be able to act more swiftly. In 2002, NATO stood down its high readiness force. I hope that today we can agree a multinational spearhead force deployable anywhere in the world in just 2 to 5 days. This would be part of a reformed NATO response force with headquarters in Poland, forward units in the Eastern Allies, and pre-positioned equipment and infrastructure to allow more exercises and, if necessary, rapid reinforcement. If we can agree this, the United Kingdom will contribute 3,500 personnel to this multinational force.
In another development, the Pentagon has announced 200 U.S. troops will be sent to Ukraine later this month for a multinational military exercise dubbed Rapid Trident. Another 280 U.S. troops will work with Ukrainian forces next week for a military exercise aboard the USS Ross in the Black Sea. To talk more about the crisis in Ukraine and the NATO summit, we're joined by Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University, also the author of a number of books on Russia and the Soviet Union. His latest piece in The Nation is headlined, Patriotic Heresy versus the New Cold War. Neo-McCarthyites have stifled democratic debate on Russia and Ukraine. So welcome to Democracy Now!, Professor Cohen. Talk about the latest developments, both the decisions out of NATO and what's happening on the ground in Ukraine.
One latest development is related to what Juan just said about New York kids. There are about 1 million refugees from eastern Ukraine. Most of them haven't fled to Russia, a lot of kids. Traditionally, in Ukraine and Russia, the first day of school is September 1. There are about 50 to 70,000 kids who needed to have started school. The Russians have made every effort to get them in school, but there are a lot of little Ukrainian kids who won't be going to school this September yet because they're living in refugee camps. And that's the story, of course. This is a horrific, tragic, completely unnecessary war in eastern Ukraine. In my own judgment, we have contributed mightily to this tragedy. I would say that historians one day will look back and say that America has blood on its hands. 3,000 people have died, most of them civilians who couldn't move quickly. That's women with small children, older women, 1 million refugees. Talk of a ceasefire that might go into place today, which would be wonderful because nobody else should die for absolutely no reason. But what's driving the new developments, partially the NATO meeting in Wales, but this stunning development that Juan mentioned, reported in the New York Review of Books, though a handful of us in this country have been trying to get it into the media for nearly 2 weeks, is that it appeared that the Ukrainian army would conquer eastern Ukraine. But what they were doing is sitting outside the cities, bombarding these cities with aircraft, rockets, heavy artillery. That's what caused the 3,000 deaths and the refugees. They've seriously damaged the entire infrastructure, industrial infrastructure of Ukraine, which is in these eastern cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, the so-called Donbass region. It turned out, though, that the Ukrainian army didn't want to enter these cities where the rebels were embedded, ensconced. It's their homes. These fighters are mainly from these cities. And while this killing was going on, the rebels were regrouping. Now there's an argument. How much help did they get from Russia? Some people are saying Russia invaded. Others say, no, Russia just gave them some technical and organizational support. But whatever happened in the last 10 days, there's been one of the most remarkable military turnarounds we've witnessed in many years. And the Ukrainian army is not only being defeated, but it's on the run. It's fleeing. It wants no more of this. It's leaving its heavy equipment behind. It's really in full-scale retreat, except in one place, the city Juan mentioned, Mariupol, where there's a fight going on as we talk now. The rebels have the city encircled. Whether that fighting will stop if the ceasefire is announced in the next couple hours, we don't know. It's a very important city, but everything has now changed. If there's negotiation, the government of Ukraine, Poroshenko, the president, our President Obama, and NATO thought that when negotiations began, the West would dictate the terms to Putin because they won the war in Ukraine. Now it's the reverse.
Now, what about this whole issue of United States forces now actually being introduced into exercises in Ukraine? To what degree do you see the Obama administration being drawn more and more into the conflict?
Well, we have to ask ourselves, because we don't fully know, because Obama's a kind of aloof figure who disappears in moments like this and reappears and says kind of enigmatic things, but are we being drawn into it, or are we driving these events? It has been true ever since NATO was created that the United States controlled NATO. Now, it is also true now that NATO is deeply divided on the Ukrainian issue. There's a war party, and the war party is led by Poland, the 3 Baltic states, to a certain extent Romania, but not so much, and Britain. Then there's a party that wants to accommodate Russia, that thinks that this is not entirely Russia's fault, and moreover, these people, the Germans, the French, the Spanish, the Italians, depend on Russia in many ways for their economic prosperity. They want to negotiate, not punish Russia. Where is Obama in this? It would appear nowhere, except occasionally he comes in, as he did in Estonia, was it yesterday, the day before, and seemed to give a speech that favors the war party.
Let's go to the comments of President Obama when he was in the former Soviet Republic of Estonia, blaming Russia for the fighting and vowing to defend the Baltic states.
It was not the government of Kiev that destabilized eastern Ukraine. It's been the pro-Russian separatists who are encouraged by Russia, financed by Russia, trained by Russia, supplied by Russia, and armed by Russia. And the Russian forces that have now moved into Ukraine are not on a humanitarian or peacekeeping mission. They are Russian combat forces with Russian weapons in Russian tanks.
That's President Obama, Professor Stephen Cohen.
It certainly is Professor Obama, President Obama. Look, here's the underlying problem. What Obama just said implies, if not asserts, that if it wasn't for Russia, Ukraine would be stable, that Russia's destabilized Ukraine. No serious person would believe that to be the case. Ukraine is in the throes of a civil war, which was precipitated by the political crisis that occurred in Ukraine last November and then this February, when the elected president of Ukraine was overthrown by a street mob, and that set off a civil war, primarily between the West, including Kiev, and the East, but not only. There's a central Ukraine that's here and there. The civil war then became, as I said it would or might when we first start talking earlier this year, a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Now, it's absolutely true that Russia has made the destabilization of Ukraine worse. It's also absolutely true that the United States has contributed to the destabilization of Ukraine. But if tomorrow the United States would go away and Russia would go away, Ukraine would still be in a civil war. And we know what civil wars are. We had one in our country. Russia had one. There were many civil wars around the world in the 20th century and elsewhere today. The point is, the only way you can end a civil war, either one side completely conquers and the other side gives up, as happened with the Confederacy in the United States, or there's a stalemate, or somebody says enough killing, because these are brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, they're part of the same family, and you negotiate. So we will see later today, perhaps, or tomorrow, whether this ceasefire comes and if it holds. Now, negotiating a civil war is terribly complex. In some ways, we're still arguing about the American Civil War. I grew up in Kentucky, segregated Kentucky, and in my childhood, people were still claiming we, the South, won. So this isn't going to end if the United States and Russia goes away, but both sides have the capacity to get these negotiations going. But when Obama says that Russia destabilized Ukraine, it's a half-truth.
Well, Steve Cohen, I want to ask you, you've come under some criticism by other Russia experts in the U.S. as being an apologist for the Russian intervention in Ukraine. I think in Forbes magazine op-ed piece there claimed that you were questioning whether Ukraine had the right to exercise control over its own territory, that it was plotting to seize its own territory. I'm wondering your response to that criticism.
Yeah, I mean, many very harsh and unpleasant, probably libelous and slanderous things have been said about me, which suggests to me that they have no factual response to me. Rather than call me a toady and an apologist and a paid hiring of the Kremlin, I'd like to hear what factual mistakes I've made, and I haven't seen any because I'm a scholar and I try not to make factual mistakes. It's not about whether Ukraine has the right to take back its territory. The problem is, as I just said, that a civil war began when we, the United States and Europe, backed a street coup that overthrew an elected president. When you overthrow a constitution, and when you overthrow a president, you're likely to get a civil war. It usually happens. Now, when you have a civil war, the country's divided. And in this case, the government in Kiev is trying to conquer where the rebels, so to speak, are located. The problem is that the rebel provinces do not recognize the legitimacy of the government in Kiev. The United States recognizes the legitimacy, but that doesn't make it legitimate. Now, let's go to what's going on in Kiev now. I mean, Obama also said, and I kind of chuckled and cried, that we're helping Ukraine build a democracy. What kind of democracy is unfolding in Kiev? All right, they had a presidential election. About a fifth of the country couldn't vote. Now, Poroshenko has called a parliamentary election in October, a month from now. But where the war is, in the south and the east, they won't vote. So you're going to end up with a rump country, further dividing the country. Meanwhile, they're shutting down democracy in Kiev. Communist Party is being banned. Another party that represents the east is being banned. People are being arrested. There's censorship kicking in. There's no democracy in Kiev because it's a wartime government. You usually don't get democracy. So these assertions by the United States that we're democracy builders, we're virtuous, and it's all Putin's fault, it's worse than a half-truth. It's actually a falsehood.
The possibility of Ukraine in NATO and what that means and what...
War.
Explain.
Next question. I mean, it's clear. It's clear. First of all, by NATO's own rules, Ukraine cannot join NATO. A country that does not control its own territory, in this case, Kiev controls less and less by the day. It's lost Crimea. It's losing the Donbass. I just described why to the war. A country that does not control its own territory cannot join Ukraine. Those are the rules. I mean, NATO. Secondly, you have to meet certain economic, political, and military criteria to join NATO. Ukraine meets none of them. Thirdly, and most importantly, Ukraine is linked to Russia not only in terms of being Russia's essential security zone, but it's linked conjugally, so to speak, intermarriage. There are millions, if not tens of millions, of Russian and Ukrainians married together. Put it in NATO, and you're going to put a barricade through millions of families. Russia will react militarily. In fact, Russia's already reacting militarily because look what they're doing in Wales today. They're going to create a so-called rapid deployment force of 4,000 fighters. What is 4,000 fighters? 15,000 or less rebels in Ukraine are crushing a 50,000-member Ukrainian army. 4,000 against a 1 million-man Russian army. It's nonsense. The real reason for creating this so-called rapid deployment force is they say it needs infrastructure. And the infrastructure, that is in plain languages, military bases, need to be on Russia's borders. And they've said where they're going to put them, in the Baltic Republic, Poland, and Romania. Now, why is this important? Because NATO has expanded for 20 years, but it's been primarily a political expansion, bringing these countries of Eastern Europe into our sphere of political influence. Now it's becoming a military expansion. So within a short period of time, we will have a new, we have a new Cold War, but here's the difference. The last Cold War, the military confrontation was in Berlin, far from Russia. Now it will be, if they go ahead with this NATO decision, right plunk on Russia's borders. Russia will then leave the historic nuclear agreement that Reagan and Gorbachev signed in 1987 to abolish short-range nuclear missiles. It was the first time a category of nuclear weapons had ever been abolished. Where are, by the way, the nuclear abolitionists today? Where's the grassroots movement, you know, free, sane? Where are these people gone to? Because we're looking at a new nuclear arms race. Russia moves these intermediate missiles now to protect its own borders as the West comes toward Russia. And the tripwire for using these weapons is enormous. One other thing. Russia has about, I think, 10,000 tactical nuclear weapons, sometimes called battlefield nuclear weapons. You use these for short distances. They can be fired. You don't need an airplane or a missile to fly them. They can be fired from artillery. But they're nuclear. They're radioactive. They've never been used. Russia has about 10,000. We have about 500. Russia's military doctrine clearly says that if Russia is threatened by overwhelming conventional forces, we will use tactical nuclear weapons. So when Obama boasts, as he has on 2 occasions, that our conventional weapons are vastly superior to Russia, he's feeding into this argument by the Russian hawks that we have to get our tactical nuclear weapons ready. So bring Ukraine into NATO, and all this stuff will be up and ready, and then it'll just take the shoot down of a Malaysian aircraft, and about which everybody's forgotten. Still nobody knows who did it. There seems to have been an agreement among the major powers not to tell us who did it, which suggests it wasn't the rebels, wasn't Russia after all. But it would take something like that, which can happen in these circumstances, to launch something that was unthinkable.
There seems to be an agreement between the major countries.
Well, in addition to the insurance company for the airplane, which technically has legal responsibility, the major countries that are doing it, Britain has the black boxes. The Netherlands are involved. There was a report the other day that these parties, these states, have agreed that they would not divulge individually what they have discovered. Now, they've had plenty of time to interpret the black boxes. There are reports from Germany that the White House version of what happened is not true. Therefore, you have to look elsewhere for the culprit who did the shooting down. They're sitting on satellite intercepts. They have the images. They won't release the air controllers' conversations in Kiev with the doomed aircraft. Why not? Did the pilot say, let me speculate, oh my God, we're being fired on by a jet fighter next to us? What's going on? Because we know there were 2 Ukrainian jet fighters. We don't know, but somebody knows. You might get somebody on who's been investigating this to find out what they actually know.
Well, we want to thank you very much.
That's a digression. I apologize.
No, that was very interesting. Thank you very much, Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton, author of a number of books on Russia and the Soviet Union. His latest piece in The Nation will link to Patriotic Heresy versus the New Cold War. Neo-McCarthyites have stifled democratic debate on Russia and Ukraine. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, BP could face up to $18 billion in fines. Judge just called BP grossly negligent and reckless. We'll find out why. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, a federal judge ruled Thursday that BP was, quote, grossly negligent and reckless in the lead up to the 2010 Deepwater Horizon explosion that killed 11 workers and caused more than 200 million gallons of oil to flood into the Gulf of Mexico. BP could face up to $18 billion in extra fines following the ruling. The company has already paid out $28 billion in claims for oil spill costs. Attorney General Eric Holder applauded the ruling.
We are pleased that the district court in New Orleans has found that the largest oil spill in United States history was caused by BP's gross negligence and willful misconduct. The court's findings will ensure that the company is held fully accountable for It's recklessness. This case, which was vigorously pursued by the United States' I think, stellar legal team, marks another significant step forward in the Justice Department's continuing efforts to seek justice on behalf of the American people for this disaster. And we are confident that this decision will serve as a strong deterrent to anyone who is tempted to sacrifice safety and the environment in the pursuit of profit.
New Orleans U.S. District Judge Carl Barbier also found BP subcontractors Transocean and Halliburton negligent in the accident. Earlier this week, the contracting giant Halliburton reached a $1.1 billion settlement with the plaintiffs, resolving almost all of the company's financial exposure.
BP declined our request for an interview. In a statement on its website, it wrote, quote, BP strongly disagrees with the decision. The law is clear that proving gross negligence is a very high bar that was not met in this case. BP believes that an impartial view of the record does not support the erroneous conclusion reached by the district court. Well, we're joined now by Antonia Juhas, author of Black Tide, the devastating impact of the Gulf oil spill. Antonia, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about the significance of this ruling.
Thanks so much for having me. Good morning. It's an incredibly important ruling. As you said in the introduction, I think the most important piece is that Judge Barbier found BP, Transocean, and Halliburton guilty and negligent for the events that led to the largest offshore oil spill in world history. These are the largest offshore operators in the world, certainly in the United States. The fact that they behaved negligently is very worrisome for offshore oil development in general. But then we square in on BP because BP, as the leaseholder and the operator, is ultimately responsible for these series of events that led to the disaster. And in the case of BP, Judge Barbier said over and over again that BP essentially chose profit over safety, chose profit over securing its responsibility to the environment, to the 11 men who died on the rig, and that profit-driven motive led it to behave with gross negligence and willful misconduct. And this is something that anyone who's been following this case, as I have for 4 years, knew was the truth, that BP acted with gross negligence. And what that means is that in the final stage of the trial that's coming up, when the judge determines how much money BP owes for this disaster, BP now faces the highest possible fines under the Clean Water Act. So for the 5 million barrels of oil that were released as a result of this disaster, it faces a potential of $4,300 per barrel of oil spilled instead of the lesser $1,100 per barrel spilled if it had simply been found negligent.
Well, Antonia Juhas, the judge's decision was quite extensive, and it also cited, as I understand, a phone conversation that happened between some of the managers of the rig and BP executives in Houston 40 minutes before the actual explosion. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, but basically, one of the things that has been very clear is that there was a series of decisions really in the year leading up to this disaster, but all the way down to the final minutes, where BP was over and over again given warnings, as was Transocean, as was Halliburton, that things were going wrong. And as in interviews that I've done with oil workers who work in the Gulf across many companies, they said BP continually made the decision, and each of the companies, to just press ahead and get to that oil. And in that 40-minute conversation, what we heard was executives on the shore in Houston and the lead BP workers on the rig essentially deciding down to the wire, there are decisions that we could be making that could slow things down, that could stop the process that's unfolding, and instead they decided to press forward. And those similar choices were made over and over and over again over the history of the development of this well.
Antonia, the profit-driven decisions that were made leading up to this.
I mean, so there were so many cases that were cited within this ruling, and I think one of the most important things is that this decision by Judge Barbier was really focused in just on the decision-making that led to the explosion and the disaster itself. So he cited very specific cases of decisions around the cement job that Halliburton conducted, decisions where BP could have run a series of tests by a company called Schlumberger that had been on the rig, that could have performed very critical tests, that BP decided, go ahead and send them home. BP used old products that were sitting on the rig instead of bringing in newer products. It used less security devices than it could have chosen. And all of these were decisions around time that it would have taken to perform the extra tests, to get the extra products, to use the better cement. And instead, it chose the quicker, cheaper method.
The blowout preventer wasn't checked in 10 years?
Excuse me?
The blowout preventer wasn't checked in 10 years?
So this is a problem that is both a problem of Transocean, the largest rig owner and operator in the Gulf of Mexico and one of the largest in the world, and BP. And the blowout preventer, essentially the key device that sits at the base of the ocean floor that is supposed to lock in the well in the case of a blowout, it had run out of batteries. The batteries had been allowed to run down. Horrific and shocking, but yes, that was one of the causes of the disaster. They simply hadn't brought it in to have it checked. And in fact, fixing the battery is something that could have been done even if they hadn't brought the blowout preventer in. But beyond that, and again, what this decision was about was these very specific decisions that led BP and Transocean and Halliburton to cause this disaster. What Barbier really couldn't rule on and is only alluded to in the decision is that these are also problems that go beyond this one disaster. So one of the problems with the blowout preventer wasn't just that it had been allowed to have its battery run out, which is a problem of both regulators, obviously inappropriate oversight, Halliburton, BP, Transocean and BP in this case, but that the blowout preventer itself, even if it had been adequately charged, wasn't probably capable of actually performing the function that it was supposed to do. It wasn't designed properly. And the broader problem with the blowout preventer is something that has been cited by the U.S. Chemical Safety Board, numerous other oversight bodies that have looked at this disaster to say, this isn't just a threat in this case, but rather another Deepwater Horizon-like disaster is not a question of if, but when, given much broader problems within the industry, including this very specific problem with the blowout preventer itself.
And in the judge's ruling, Halliburton came off pretty lightly, actually, because the judge ruled that BP was 67% responsible for the catastrophe, that Transocean was 30% responsible for the catastrophe, and Halliburton only 3%. Your sense of the relative guilt of the parties involved here?
Well, that's really a determination about the fact that BP is ultimately the leaseholder and operator and is ultimately bears responsibility. But if you read through the decision, Halliburton is found to have performed with egregiously, to be negligent, to have made decisions that were illegal and were simply not appropriate for ensuring the safety of this well. And Halliburton is one of the largest energy services companies in the world, certainly one of the largest operators in offshore oil development. The fact that it's making really fairly basic decisions egregiously and negligently when it comes to the risks involved with offshore drilling, which are, of course, enormous. Again, the largest offshore oil drilling disaster in history, 5 million barrels of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico, that's very worrisome. The attribution of responsibility really had more to do at the end of the day with the fact that BP is the lessee, it is the operator, it's ultimately responsible, but each of these actors made very serious bad decisions and misconduct, including Halliburton and Transocean.
Finally, this in context, Antonia, of President Obama expanding offshore drilling.
Yeah, very worrisome. Again, this decision was very specifically looking at this incident, but the many, many oversight boards over the past 4 years that have looked at this disaster have said over and over again that this disaster is representative of systemic problems within the industry. And I believe that those problems have to do with the fact that the industry is moving ahead based on technology and money. It has the technology to physically do the drilling. It doesn't have the technology to protect in the case of a disaster, and it's moving very rapidly ahead in terms of risk aversion. It doesn't particularly care about the risks associated because the oil's out there, and that the likelihood of another disaster is very real. And at the same moment that all of the bodies that are investigating this disaster have come to those same conclusions, the Obama administration is expanding offshore drilling, looking to move offshore drilling off the coast of the Atlantic, in new parts of Alaska and the Arctic, and to move even deeper into the Gulf of Mexico, significantly farther out and deeper than where the Deepwater Horizon disaster occurred. And I think all the findings tell us that this just isn't safe. The industry doesn't actually know how to do this in terms of averting risk, dealing with catastrophes when they happen, and preventing them from happening in the first place. Just because it has a profit motive and a lot of oil in its sights doesn't mean it should be allowed to pursue that profit and that oil. And Tony Uhas, I want to thank you for being with us, author of Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll talk about the fast food protests yesterday. More than 400 people arrested across the United States. Stay with us.
Ones we've been waiting for. We coming, we ready, we ready, we coming, we ready, we ready, we coming, we ready, we coming, we ready, we ready. This is our moment, our movement, our time. We want it, we coming, we ready, let's ride. We fight for 15. Fight for this dream, you and I unified to strike against the machine. This right-wing regime got the country on lean, cause the richest companies get the biggest subsidies, but be wanting me to leave, making $7.25, coming home to my family and staring in hungry eyes. No, not another day, cause our movement's coming alive, and I'm on the front line, so you know I'm coming for mine. Chicago, Milwaukee, rise, New York to the west side, St. Louis, KC, and Detroit is ready to rise. All we got is our lives, our dignity, and our pride. Our enemy is the lies, the remedy is our energy. When we see it's the time to turn up in these streets so deep that police can't see the concrete.
We Coming by Jaziri X, a song written for the Fight for 15. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, fast food workers fighting for a $15 hourly wage and union rights took to the streets in 150 cities across the country Thursday, from Las Vegas to Chicago and Detroit to Little Rock, Arkansas, and here in New York City.
My name is Dejan Thornton. I work because I'm trying to keep my house. I don't want to be homeless. And I just became the head of household. And I work at Wendy's on 125th Street. I got joint separation and they didn't give me any sick leave, and they still expect me to do the normal duties I was doing before my arm was messed up. It's just a lot of little things that I don't get paid to deal with.
More than 400 workers and their supporters were arrested during the strikes as they engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience by blocking streets during rush hour. For more, we're joined in Pittsburgh by Shona Osborne, who's a fast food worker who previously worked for McDonald's, now works for Wendy's. She was arrested Thursday during the fast food worker strikes. Welcome to Democracy Now! You were involved also with the protests at the McDonald's shareholder meeting. Can you talk, Shona, about why you went out yesterday and got arrested?
Yes, thank you for having me. And I went out yesterday basically to join my family. We are called the Fight for 15 and trying to get a union. And we are trying basically to fight this poverty that we are living in, trying to end disrespectful wages and just have a better wage for our family.
And in terms of the sit-downs and the protests, why did you feel you had to resort to that as well?
Basically, to let these corporations and these franchises know that this movement is not a game. We took a civil disobedience willingly. We volunteered that we were going to take a nonviolent civil disobedience and sit down just to make the point to these CEOs and corporates that we're not playing. You need to hear what we're saying. We are your workers. If it wasn't for us, you wouldn't have these companies.
Do you mind talking about how much you make right now for Wendy's?
Yes, I make $7.25 an hour.
And talk about what exactly you're demanding.
I'm demanding $15 an hour for my pay.
And what's been the response of fellow workers to the idea that you can have such a huge increase if they band together?
Well, it goes by both hands. Some people are in agreement with us. Yesterday, we had a lot of people from the public just walk off jobs and walk off the street and join our strike line. And it also goes to people who are ignorant to the situation, doesn't know the understanding and the meaning of our movement, that once we go up, everyone goes up. The economy, wages are already going up, and we can't afford to live at $7.25.
We're also joined by Mary Kay Henry, president of SEIU, Service Employees International Union, which represents 2 million workers in healthcare, public and property services, and has been a major backer of the fast food worker strikes. You've been calling also on home health care aides to march alongside the fast food strikers. Talk about the success of the strike, as you see it, Mary Kay Henry, and why SEIU is involved.
Well, Ashona and workers all across this country, Amy, took this movement to the next level yesterday and shined a light on the gross inequity in pay for these jobs where people work hard and can't even afford basic necessities and make ends meet. And so $15 in a union is a way to make sure that people have a living wage job where they can support their families and get ahead. And home care workers know the same experience, where they don't get enough hours to make ends meet. Most home care workers in this country earn minimum wage, and so they decided to join with fast food workers yesterday in building the broadest, most powerful movement possible to insist that it's possible to work hard for a living and be able to afford enough to eat, and then spend that money in our economy so we can buy groceries, hardware store, get clothes for our kids, and get the economy roaring again for everybody in every community in this country.
And Mary Kay Henry, one of the arguments of many of these firms, as this movement has been gathering strength, is that they essentially work with independent franchisees who are small businessmen, really, and that they operate and they own their own franchises. Could you talk about that in the context of the recent National Labor Relations Board decision?
Well, I've heard from workers like Ashona and DJ in Sacramento yesterday that every decision in that store is dictated by the multinational corporation that has the contract with the franchisee. How much Coke, what the cost of a burger is, what napkins are bought from where. And so workers understand that the shots that are being called are by McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King, and that's why they are holding the corporations accountable for lifting wages, because franchisee contracts can be changed and record profits can be put in the pockets of frontline workers so they can spend it in their communities, and we can all share in the prosperity of the incredibly hard work that fast food workers are doing each and every day.
Mary Kay Henry, Steve Greenhouse writes in the New York Times that within the SEIU, there has been some grumbling about why has the union spent millions of dollars to back the fast food workers when they're not in the industries that the union has traditionally represented. What is your answer to that?
Well, that SEIU members and leaders all across this country were proud to stand with fast food workers yesterday. I was in Oakland with healthcare workers, janitors, security officers. They know that when fast food workers win, wages are going to rise across the service sector and will have an impact on home care workers and child care workers and airport workers. So we are incredibly proud and thrilled to have the backs of the fast food workers because we agree with them. We're going to do whatever it takes to help them win.
And Mary Kay Henry, President Obama on Labor Day specifically mentioned the fast food workers movement. And I think we have a clip of him speaking. Let's see if we can hear that.
All across the country right now, there's a national movement going on, made up of fast food workers organizing to lift wages so they can provide for their families with pride and dignity. There is no denying a simple truth. America deserves a raise. Folks are doing very well on Wall Street. They're doing very well in the corporate boardrooms. Give America a raise.
That was President Obama on Labor Day, just before these protests broke out. And was there any? Was this a coincidence, or was your union able to get to the president to say, "Listen, why don't you mention this because we're getting ready to have these major protests this week"?
I think the president and people all throughout this nation are incredibly inspired by the fearlessness of these workers who are not going to stop until they win. We looked at that clip from the president at 5:45 yesterday morning in Oakland, and workers who hadn't had a chance because they were working on Labor Day were incredibly thrilled that the president of the United States is saying that what they're doing makes complete sense, that it is wrong for multinational corporations that are earning record profits to be paying poverty wages. And what workers are doing is joining together in the tradition of this country to say that we deserve better and that we're going to get it for ourselves, our families, and for the future.
Shona Osborne, are you afraid of retribution, of retaliation against your protests? This is the second time you've been arrested.
No, ma'am, I'm not. It just motivates me to keep doing it more and more.
Do you think you'll win this? Have you seen a change? Do you see a change in attitude, for example, at Wendy's, both with the workers and also with management, how they're dealing with this?
I see a change with the workers. This strike that we had, as opposed to our last strike, we had way more people walk off the job and way more people from the public and workers come and join us as we were striking. We started out with about 10 people at 5 o'clock in the morning. By the time it came about noon, we had over 200 people all striking together as one.
And Mary Kay Henry, I'd like to ask you about the growth of this movement. We're getting more and more cities around the country looking at living wage laws. We're seeing a spread of the fast food workers movement. Your sense of whether any of these major companies are on the verge or likely to finally concede on the main demand of $15 an hour?
I have no idea what these companies are thinking, Juan, but I know that there's been a huge change that these workers have accomplished. 100,000 workers in Seattle are going to see their wages rise to 15. We just settled a collective bargaining agreement for 23,000 LA Unified School workers. They're going to go to 15 in January. Johns Hopkins hospital workers just negotiated $15. It is an amazing movement when there's already victories that fast food workers can take incredible pride that they made happen. And that's why we're so glad that 1.5 million home care workers are answering the call and joining this movement so we can spread it throughout the entire service sector and make sure that when you work hard for a living, you can afford to feed your family and maybe even get your hair done or take a vacation someday. And we have got to change the nature of work in this country, and these workers are leading the way for us.
Mary Kay Henry, how does the immigrant rights movement tie into this, with immigrant rights activists suffering a setback, believing President Obama was immediately going to issue executive order around immigration and stopping deportations, but that doesn't look like it's happening before the midterm elections?
Well, there's an incredible intersection of the immigrant rights movement and the fast food workers movement. I saw it in Oakland yesterday. Many of the workers were Latino and had immigrated from Central America and Mexico. We've seen it across this country as the city organizations get built in local coalition with the immigrant justice movement. We still hope the president will take swift and bold action, but we understand that we have to grow a powerful movement that is not subject to the bad politics of this nation, but makes the case where everybody in this nation understands that we have to get the Republican House to act on common sense immigration reform so 11 million people can enter our democracy and join in the fullness of our economy. And we are not going to stop our movement building on immigrant justice or economic justice until we win.
Mary Kay Henry, we want to thank you for being with us, president of SEIU, Service Employees International Union. Thanks for joining us from the Bay Area. And Shona Osborne from Pittsburgh, working at Wendy's, had also worked at McDonald's, arrested Thursday during the fast food worker strikes there. Over 400 people were arrested across the United States. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Aaron Mate, Noreen Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Alkoff, Hani Massoud, Rabi Karen, Dina Guzder. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.